Hello, welcome. This is Thursday evening live stream. We'll be starting in less than a minute. Okay. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Okay, just seeing in the chat that there's some confusion about the link to this stream. There's apparently somehow I fumbled and got an extra notification with a different link. But some people have found it, so I hope that it's we'll just carry on, see how it goes. So we're doing a series on the Pali literature, and last week we did the first session on the Vinaya text on the Sutta Vibhanga, which is the collection of rules. And today we're going to deal with the rest of the Vinaya. There are 2 or 3 books, depending on how you count them. There's the Khandakas, which are divided into Chulavaga and Mahavaga, which are sometimes counted as separate books. And there's the Parivara. I'll deal with the Parivara is the last one. I'll deal with that first because it probably requires the least explanation. It's probably a late edition as a kind of a summary or a primer for students learning the Vinaya. It's in a very kind of terse, often question and answer format. One popular idea is that it could be dated to the to Asoka's council, which is generally reckoned the 4th council. When there were a number of additions to the canon at that time, and it's considered the canon was closed under King Asoka's council. So I can imagine it was used by junior monks and novices as a study textbook for learning the Vinaya. It basically repeats the essential information from the other Vinaya books, but in a simpler form, like without any elaborate origin stories and so on. Of more interest are the other 2 books, the Chulavaga and Mahavaga. Chula, of course, means little, and Maha means big. The Mahavaga is the first one, and the 2 together are called the Khandakas. The Mahavaga begins with a long narrative section, which is probably about a third of the whole, and it's a very interesting source for us. It covers the life of the Buddha from just after his enlightenment through to the meeting with an ordination of Sariputta and Moggallana. So this is really our best source for a consecutive life story of the Buddha after his enlightenment, but it only covers the first few years. The only other kind of consecutive narrative of the Buddha's life that we have covers the last years of his life in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. All the years in between we have to piece together bits and pieces scattered throughout the suttas. There isn't a consecutive narrative account other than this one. So this includes the first three discourses of the Buddha that are also found in the Sutta Pitaka, the Sutta on the Four Noble Truths, which was his turning of the wheel of the Dhamma Sutta, the very first one. The Sutta on Not Self, and that's the Lakkhana Sutta, and the Fire Sutta, which he delivered to a large group of fire ascetics that he converted to Buddhism. The rest of the Mahavaga has a kind of pseudo-narrative format in that it's episodic in the sense it deals with various procedures of the Sangha, principally ordination and ranger retreat. And there's quite a bit about ordination, who's eligible for ordination, and how the ordination procedure should be done. And it's presented as we saw in the Sutta with Banga, the rules each have an origin story. So it's seen here that the Buddha is kind of developing these procedures as he goes in response to situations. Excuse me. So this is the main source we have for how to conduct an ordination ceremony, for example. The Mahavaga. The Chulavaga continues the same kind of material, dealing with a number of mostly Sangha procedures, but also some minor rules and advice for things like using medicine. But it deals with, for example, the appointment of Sangha officers, dealing with schisms, how to reconcile the Sangha, and the Uposatha ceremony, the chanting of the Patimokkha. And all these are again dealt with in a kind of episodic fashion. But the principal interest in the Chulavaga, just as we had a long narrative section at the beginning of the Mahavaga, we have 3 narrative chapters at the end of the Chulavaga that are of considerable interest for Buddhist history. The first one deals with the founding of the Bhikkhuni order, the order for women, and it details the Buddhist stepmother asking for ordination for herself and her women followers, and the Buddha at first being reluctant, and Ananda convincing him to ordain the women, and the laying down of the Garudamas, that's special rules for Bhikkhunis, establishment of the Bhikkhuni order. So this particular text has been of considerable interest in recent times, with the movement beginning in Sri Lanka to restore the Bhikkhuni order. This text has taken, been extensively examined and studied. It may be, in part at least, it may also be a late there's some late editorial work in this sutta. Possibly there's a strong argument to be made. There's a book by a monk. I think he's a Sri Lankan, Gnana Dhamma, who the main topic of the book was a close examination of the Digha Nikaya, and but he has a chapter examining this section of the Chulavaga, and he makes some strong arguments that this is a late addition. One of the passages in this section that's been discussed a lot and has caused a lot of controversy is in the Buddha's reluctance to ordain women. He said, if I ordain women, the Dhamma will only last for 500 years. But if I don't ordain them, it'll last for 1,000 years. So obviously that it's lasted longer than 1,000 years anyway. But what Gnana Dhamma points out, which is an astute observation, is that what the Buddha said particularly was the Sadhamma will last. Sadhamma meaning the good Dhamma, or the true Dhamma. That's a word that's not found elsewhere in the canon, but where it is found is in later polemical literature when the Theravada was in rivalry with Mahayana schools. They called themselves Mahayana, the great vehicle, and they called the Theravadas and other old schools the Hinayana, or lesser vehicle. Likewise, the traditional schools called themselves the Sadhamma, or the good Dhamma, or the true Dhamma, and the Mahayana they referred to as the Miccha Dhamma, or the false Dhamma. It was part of the kind of rivalry at that time. So this would, if this is correct, it would date the this section of the Chulavaga, or at least those paragraphs, to about 500 years after the Buddha's time, which would then kind of explain the prophecy. Be that as it may, it's an interesting historical source. The other two chapters dealing with historical matters cover the first and second councils, or no, sorry, the second and third councils no, I was right the first time. The first and second council of the Buddhist councils. The first council was held immediately after the Buddha's decease, and at that time, Ananda recited the suttas and Upali recited the Vinaya. So this is the establishment of the canon at that time, and there's a detailed account of the procedure carried on at the first council, including what's called the trial of Ananda, which is kind of an interesting bit. Before Ananda could be accepted to recite the Sutta Pitaka, the elders wanted to clear up some doubts about him, and they brought a number of charges against him that all seem, or many of them seem to us to be kind of unfair. For example, one of the charges was that he disrespected the Buddha by holding the Buddha's robe with his foot. And he explained that he was sewing the Buddha's robe had a tear, and he had no one to help him, so he was stretching out the cloth by holding it with one hand and one foot while he sewed with the other hand. But I think this, although it seems to us unfair, this scrupulosity of the elders was important in making it absolutely clear that the the canon had a pure origin. That it came from a pure place. The second council occurred, and this is the last chapter in the Chulavaga. It occurred about 100 years after the Buddhist time, when Buddhism had spread widely over northern India, and different groups of monks in different places were diverging from each other, and there was the second council was an attempt to bring everybody back on into one agreement to unify the Sangha, and basically it was a failure in that the two main branches broke off at that time. Were called the Starviravada and the Mahasangikas. The Mahasangikas may have been the ancestors of the Mahayana, and the Starviravada were the ancestors of the Theravada, Sarvastivada, and other traditionalist schools. Now, what is kind of interesting about this this text is, of course, the Chulavaga version of the account is written from the Theravada perspective, but there also exists I think it only exists in Tibetan translation, a version from the Mahasangika side, and the accounts differ considerably. In the Theravada version, the dispute between the monks was all on questions of Vinaya. The Mahasangikas were trying to relax some of the rules. For example, eating in the afternoon. They had they had what they called the two-finger allowance. You put a stick in the ground to this is before, of course, the invention of mechanical clocks. The way you would find noon is putting a stick in the ground and seeing when the shadow crossed from west to east. Noon is when the shadow is due south. And the Mahasangika said that you could eat after the shadow passed the south until it had moved at least 2 finger breadths. So there's a number of these kind of, which seem quite minor relaxations of the rules, but the traditionalists didn't like the idea of relaxing the Vinaya at all. They wanted to stick to the original formulation. The other version that we have from Tibetan text has the disputes all about Dhamma, and doesn't mention Vinaya disputes at all. And the doctrinal disputes mostly revolve around the definition of a Sotapanna and the definition of an Arahant. And the definition of a Buddha, for different stages of enlightenment. And it seems like the main thrust of which would tend to also point in the Mahayana direction, the main thrust was to reduce the status of an Arahant, particularly with the idea that an Arahant could relapse. Like, you could be an Arahant and then not be an Arahant. You could lose it, which is completely against the Theravada view. And elevate the Buddha into a more semi-divine kind of status, which is a tendency that was taken to extremes in some schools of Mahayana. So we have these, in the Chulavaga, we have these very important historical accounts of the founding of the Bhikkhuni order, the first and second councils. And there are primary sources for those episodes. Anyone interested in learning more about the councils in Buddhist history, I did a YouTube series. You can find it on my channel. which deals with early Buddhist history, and it was produced in collaboration. Like I was the providing the content, but um, it's got like diagrams and charts and everything. It was all put together very artistically by Dinka Pignon, a videographer. It's actually quite a good production she did. So that's the finishes the brief survey of the text of the Vinaya. I'll say that now the accessibility of these texts. Excuse me a moment. These are the PTS editions, which you can still purchase from the Polytext Society in the UK. The translations are pretty good. They're done in mid 20th century. I've also today I was looking around to see if there's any versions online, and there does seem to be some versions. Sutta Central has a write-up on these books, but I don't see a full translation there. But there's another site, Wisdom Library, that has translations of the Chulavaga and Mahavaga. I don't know how good the translations are or who did them. As far as hard copies, I don't think that anybody has produced another version, a book form. So these translations are a bit dated, although they're pretty good. I mean, they're mid 20th century, and they're by I.B. Horner. So I'll leave it there, and please, if you have any discussion, anything you want to ask, put it in the chat, and I'll stay on and deal with some questions and answers. We'll start on the talking about the Abhidhamma texts. Okay, here we go. Some question popping up. How are the great standards used to evaluate how Vinaya should be applied in modern situations, such as handling credit cards? A good question. What are called the great standards? They're laid down in one of these texts. I can't remember now whether it was Mahavaga or Chulavaga. I think it was Mahavaga. Where the Buddha says if there's a situation arises that is not clearly covered by the rules, one should apply a standard of applying applying common sense and seeing what's similar to the rule and how it differs and so on. So the rule for monks is that in terms of monks are not, as many of you probably know, bhikkhus are not allowed to have money, not allowed to have and spend money. And the actual wording of the rule is not to have gold and silver. So in a narrow literal interpretation of the rule, even paper money would be allowed, but nobody interprets like that because of the great standards. The intention of the rule was to the monks not to engage in commerce of any kind, and the only money at the time were gold and silver coins. That was money, and it wasn't foreseen that there would be other forms of money. So a credit card is a form of money. It can be spent as the same as gold and silver coins. So it's not allowed by application of the great standards. I have heard that it was permitted by the Buddha to relax minor points of the monastic code. I imagine this would include sumptuary rules about dress, modifying it. Yeah, I think I talked about that last week as well. The Buddha had said to Ananda shortly before his death, he said, Ananda, when I pass on, if the monks wish to relax the lesser and minor rules, they can do so. But then at the first council, they were unable to agree what should count as a lesser and minor rule. And this was one of the reasons they criticized Ananda, because he didn't ask the Buddha for a clarification. So they decided that be on the safe side, we'll just keep all the rules. Why did ordaining women make the true Dhamma last only half the time? Well, actually, it didn't. I mean, because if that prophecy had come true, then the Sangha would have died out, around the time of Christ, or shortly after. It would have lasted 500 years. But it's still here. So this is one reason why to doubt that passage is actually genuine. What we do know historically is that the Indian society, and this has been pointed out by historical scholars, that Indian society became more patriarchal in the centuries after the Buddha. There was definitely a patriarchal tendency already at the Buddha's time, but it became more developed in the few hundred years after the Buddha. So if that text actually dates from the early AD period, then it's likely that there was a patriarchal or even a misogynist attitude on behalf of the editors of that text. But what would apply to the Buddhist time was it would have been controversial even at the Buddhist time to ordain women. It would have been seen by people outside of the Sangha as being too lax. Okay, there's a quick continuation of the other question about relaxing the rules. Rules about dress for differences in climate. Is there any guidance about what's a minor rule? Well, this is where the great standards can be applied to relax a rule somewhat. Like I live in a cold climate. I was ordained in the tropics in Thailand, and I wear sweaters and socks and boots, which would be not allowed in Thailand, and also not allowed in a narrow interpretation of the rule. But we have an example of the Buddha relaxing a sumptuary rule in the case of the Bhikkhu Sona, who lived in a colder part of India, and the Buddha allowed him to wear sandals, and the monks were generally going barefoot. Dear Bhante, what monastic rules beyond 10 precepts could lay people apply that would help us in our achievements? I don't think it's really necessary or even appropriate for lay people to try and keep the Bhikkhu Vinaya. The 5 precepts is good enough generally, but then you can take the 8 for periods of time. 10 would be hard to do in a lay life, because that means you couldn't have money. I also notice that most suttas are directed towards bhikkhus and not lay people. Is that correct? Yes, I think that's generally true. There are some suttas that are specifically addressed to a lay audience, but mostly the Buddha was teaching his bhikkhus. Okay, so I think we'll stop there, and next week we're gonna have a survey of the Abhidhamma text. I don't want to get into so much Abhidhamma theory. I've done talks on that topic, but just a survey of the texts that constitute the Abhidhamma Pitaka, and we'll leave it there. Thank you for attending.